All right, let's jump right into this explainer and look at how international sports content, we're talking game narrations, live broadcasts, sports podcasts, can actually act as a sort of linguistic Trojan horse to help you master new languages and cultural dialects. If you've ever tried to learn a language purely from a textbook, you've probably felt how disconnected it can be from how people actually speak on the street. But what if you could soak up the nuances of a language, its cultural history, and all its everyday slang just by tuning into a soccer match? Today, we're going to use the completely fascinating differences between Brazilian and European Portuguese sports terminology as a case study to show you exactly how this works. Picture this scenario. You've been studying Portuguese for a while. You're feeling pretty confident. You tune in to a World Cup broadcast, knowing the base language, but suddenly, you realize you have absolutely no idea what the commentator is saying. You're waiting to hear about the Brazilian time, their word for team, but instead, the commentator just keeps talking about an equipa. It's literally the exact same sport, the exact same base language, but a totally different vocabulary.
The folks over at G1 Globo actually captured this perfectly, noting that it almost feels like listening to another language entirely. It's a really jarring moment. But here is the secret. That feeling of being completely lost is actually the absolute best classroom for language learners. The vocabulary of football is so deeply embedded in the daily lives of millions of people that it naturally magnifies these linguistic differences. It essentially turns a simple 90-minute match into a masterclass on regional dialects.
So let's do a rapid-fire look at the vocabulary of the pitch. While Brazilians passionately cheer for their goleiro to make a crazy save, the Portuguese are depending on their guarda-redes, which literally translates to the net guard, to protect the goal. You're instantly learning two completely different ways a culture conceptualizes the exact same job on the field. Honestly, even the very ground they play on shifts beneath their feet depending on who happens to be holding the microphone. In Brazil, the players are sprinting across the gramado, which comes from grama, their word for grass. But jump across the Atlantic to Portugal, and that exact same patch of green magically transforms into a relva, derived from relva. And the rules of the game? Yeah, they sound totally different too. When the ball goes out of bounds off a defending player, a Brazilian commentator is going to enthusiastically scream for an escanteio. But a European Portuguese broadcast? They keep it pretty short and simple, just calling it a canto. Even the sheer heartbreak of accidentally scoring on your own net is linguistically split. In Brazil, you've committed a goal contra, a goal against yourself. In Portugal, it's an autogolo, an autogol. Just by paying attention to the commentary, you're effortlessly mapping out these synonyms and regional variations without ever having to crack open a dictionary. Now, what is really fascinating here is how this ties into pedagogy and spatial strategy. According to physical education methodologies, team sports require players to assimilate some pretty complex rules of action, spatial management, and communication. So when you watch a game in a target language, you aren't just hearing random words in a vacuum. You are watching those words physically play out in real-time space. You see penetration, or penetration, happen right as the word is spoken. It basically turns the assimilation of play rules into a highly visual, deeply contextual lesson in communication. So the real takeaway here is that we are looking at an entirely different dialectical ecosystem. The differences encompass absolutely everything on and off the field. A center back is a zagueiro in Brazil, but a defensa central in Portugal. A striker is an atacante versus an avançado. A defensive midfielder is a volante in Brazil, but a trinco in Europe. It even extends to the cheering crowds up in the stands. You've got the Brazilian torcida against the Portuguese claque. Once you grasp this ecosystem, you've just unlocked a massive chunk of cultural vocabulary. Section 1, Cultural and Historical Evolution. Let's move into this next part and see how this vocabulary builds into a much deeper understanding of cultural history. Because language is never just a list of words. It's the living, breathing history of a people. Linguists point out that since colonization over 5 centuries ago, the Portuguese language naturally splintered. As it made its home in Brazil, it came into contact with indigenous populations, African languages brought over through the slave trade, and huge waves of international immigrants. The language basically soaked up entirely new sounds and social realities, depending on its geographic home, which is exactly why the sports terminology diverged so heavily over time. Expert linguist Cynthia Piccini hits the nail on the head here. She notes that neither variant is more correct than the other. It's not at all a matter of right or wrong. Actually, these differences enrich the language. They serve as a mirror, reflecting a nation's totally unique identity and historical journey. Learning these terms through sports means you are directly engaging with the history of that culture. And this is exactly why sports broadcasts are so incredibly valuable. They give you unfiltered access to cultural nuances that completely defy direct translation. For instance, researchers at the University of Sao Paulo highlight the Brazilian term chocolate. Now, in a football context, a chocolate is a massive, humiliating win over the opposing team. If you translated that literally using an English dictionary, you'd think they were talking about a sweet treat. But culturally, it's the equivalent of saying a team put up a cricket score in British English. You can really only learn this kind of rich, localized slang by tuning into the culture itself. But hey, language is totally a two-way street, especially today. With the modern cross-border flow of sports broadcasts, social media, and players transferring between leagues, some terms have successfully migrated. Brazilian words like crack, meaning a star player, and dribbly for dribble have successfully crossed the ocean and are now widely understood and even used daily in Portugal. Sports actually act as a real-time bridge connecting these distinct dialects. Section 2. Beyond the soccer field, everyday applications. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is great if I want to be a sports commentator, but what about real life? Well, let's step off the pitch and see why this method is so ridiculously practical for everyday life. The linguistic flexibility you pick up from watching sports directly applies to real-world scenarios. Just as the sports terms diverge, so do everyday words. If you need to ask a friend for a lift to the stadium in Brazil, you're going to ask for a carona. But if you're hanging out in Lisbon, you'll need to ask for a boleia. Training your ear to catch these rapid differences during a fast-paced game makes catching them in a casual conversation an absolute breeze. This divergence filters all the way down to your wardrobe, believe it or not. Putting on your socks for a morning run means grabbing a media in Sao Paulo, but if you're doing that exact same run over in Portugal, you'd be putting on a beuga. And this highlights how sports serve as the ultimate gateway to social life. Understanding the intense passion, the slang, and the regional flavor of a football match naturally prepares you to navigate the local social scene. I mean, if your team wins and you want to go out and celebrate, you're heading to a farra in Brazil, but a pandega in Portugal. The cultural immersion you get from a 90-minute broadcast gives you the exact context you need to thrive at that party. By using sports as an entry point, you are building an expansive vocabulary framework that effortlessly translates to every aspect of daily life. Heading to the gym is academia in Brazil and ginásio in Portugal. Addressing a young woman is moça in Brazil, but rapariga in Portugal. Even a simple trip to the butcher to get meat for a barbecue changes from açougue to talho. Sports teach you to be adaptable, to listen closely to context, and to really appreciate the rich variations within a single language. So the next time you decide you want to learn a language, maybe try skipping the dry textbook exercises for a day. Turn on a foreign sports match or a game narration podcast. Listen to the absolute passion of the commentators, and just let the game teach you. It really begs the question, if a simple soccer match can teach you this much about history, dialect, and culture, what other cultural broadcasts could unlock a whole new worldview for you?